The year was 1895, and along the banks of the Black River in southern Missouri, a silence heavier than the summer heat hung in the air. Farmers spoke of wagons that went missing, of families who set out to cross the valley and were never seen again. The most recent case had shaken the entire town of Mill Creek, a wagon abandoned at the river's edge, horses unhitched and wandering loose, belongings strewn as if dropped mid-step, and yet no trace of the travelers who had packed them. The scene had left even the most hardened men unsettled. The discovery spread quickly, whispered from porch to porch, until it landed on the desk of Sheriff Jonathan Hale. At 42, Hale carried the bearing of a man who had lived through storms far darker than the Ozark woods. A veteran of the Civil War, he had traded battlefields for the dusty main street of Mill Creek, believing that peace could be maintained with steady eyes and a fair hand. Yet what now faced him was neither a drunken quarrel nor a thief caught red-handed, but a mystery deep and foul as the river itself. Before we uncover the truth hidden along those waters, let me pause for a moment. If you're drawn to stories of forgotten times and mysteries buried in history, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these tales alive and brings us closer to the shadows of the past that still echo today. Jonathan rode out to the Black River at first light, his horse's hooves striking against the packed earth. The landscape was unforgiving, oak and pine pressing in from both sides, the soil damp with recent rains. When he arrived, the wagon lay tilted on its side, one wheel sunk in the mud. The air smelled of wet earth and stagnant water, and though the morning sun burned brightly overhead, a chill clung to the riverbank. He dismounted slowly, scanning the ground with sharp, deliberate eyes. Scattered about were clothes, a Bible, a tin plate half buried in the silt. The food barrels were untouched, lids sealed tight. He crouched to study the mud, where the marks of struggle had etched themselves into the earth. Small prints and large ones tangled together, the shapes broken by dragging lines. A man could tell there had been fear here, quick and desperate. "Strangers," Jonathan muttered under his breath. The wagon was not from Mill Creek. Its style was more common among families traveling from Arkansas northward, seeking work in the growing towns of Missouri. Yet if bandits had attacked, why take the horses but leave behind food, clothing, and valuables? It did not add up. When Jonathan returned to town that afternoon, he found his deputy waiting on the steps of the sheriff's office. Samuel Carter was young, just 27, with a restless energy that made him eager for action. "Heard about the wagon," Samuel said, pushing his hat back. "Folks are saying the river took 'em." "The river doesn't take people," Jonathan replied firmly, though he could not deny the unease that stirred in him. Inside the office, Dr. Eliza Thornton was already seated. A woman of 34, she carried herself with calm authority. Her reputation extended far beyond medicine. She had the gift of noticing what others overlooked. "Sheriff," she said, her voice low but steady, "it isn't the first time. I've kept records. Travelers vanish, always by the water, always outsiders." Jonathan studied her in silence, his jaw set. If she was right, then this was not a single tragedy but part of a pattern. Something was drawing strangers toward the river, and once they reached its banks, they were gone. That night, as the lamplight flickered across his desk, Jonathan opened the town ledger and wrote a single line beneath the date: "Another family lost to the Black River. Cause unknown." His hand lingered over the page, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions, and in that silence, Sheriff Jonathan Hale knew one thing for certain: he would not rest until he uncovered what waited along the river's dark edge. The next morning, Jonathan rose before dawn, the weight of the abandoned wagon still pressing on his thoughts. The sheriff's badge pinned to his vest was no longer just a mark of duty. It felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into questions that refused to be answered. He saddled his horse and rode with Samuel at his side, the younger man eager to prove himself useful. Mist clung to the lowlands as they approached the river, veiling the trees in a pale gray shroud. When they arrived, the wagon was as they had left it, leaning helplessly in the mud, like a skeleton of someone's broken journey. Jonathan dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Samuel followed, eyes darting nervously from the wagon to the river. "Don't look like no robbery," Samuel said, crouching to pick up a child's wooden toy from the mud. "If I was a thief, I'd take this wagon whole, sell the lot." Jonathan shook his head. "Thieves don't leave food behind either. Not in times like these." He bent down, his hand brushing over a faint line in the soil. Footprints, more than one. They lead straight toward the water. Samuel knelt beside him, squinting. But then they stop. He glanced at the dark surface of the river, the slow current carrying broken branches downstream. "Sheriff, you think they drowned?" Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Not with the horses gone. Someone led them away, and yet—" His voice trailed off, the weight of uncertainty settling in. As they stood in silence, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. Dr. Eliza Thornton appeared, her skirts catching the damp morning air, her expression unreadable. She had walked all the way from town, a satchel of instruments slung across her shoulder. "You should have sent for me sooner," she said, kneeling by the wagon with practiced calm. She sifted through the scattered belongings with careful hands. No blood, no torn fabric. Whoever was here left in haste, but not in violence. At least not the kind you can measure in wounds. Samuel frowned. Then what drove them into the river? Folks say there's something unnatural here. Eliza gave him a sharp look. "Fear spreads quicker than truth, Deputy. Don't mistake one for the other." Jonathan studied her closely. She wasn't dismissing the strangeness, only refusing to let superstition fill the gaps. That was why he valued her insight. He had seen enough men lost to shadows of their own making to know that fear could be more dangerous than bullets. Still, the sheriff could not ignore the signs etched into the mud, the footprints, the drag marks, the confusion in the soil where more than one struggle had unfolded. He walked toward the riverbank, the water lapping gently against the shore. There, half buried in reeds, he found a boot print far larger than the others. "This wasn't just a family moving careless," he said quietly. "There were others here. Men." Samuel straightened, his hand resting nervously on the handle of his revolver. "So we're looking at bandits after all." Jonathan didn't answer right away. He felt the weight of the river pressing in, its dark surface giving nothing back. If it was bandits, they took no spoils. "That doesn't sit right with me." Eliza joined him at the edge, her gaze fixed on the slow-moving water. "Patterns matter, Sheriff. I've seen them before in sickness, in behavior, in tragedy. Strangers go missing, and always by this river. If we wish to understand it, we must not stop at the obvious." Her words lingered with him as the three rode back toward Mill Creek. The air was heavy, the cicadas droning in the distance, and Jonathan felt the stirrings of something deeper than crime. He couldn't name it yet, but it gnawed at him. That evening, as lamplight filled the sheriff's office, he wrote another note in the ledger. Signs of struggle, no robbery, clues lead to river, unresolved. He paused, staring at the page, then closed the book with a firm hand. The Black River was hiding more than missing families. It was hiding the truth, and Jonathan Hale was determined to tear it from the shadows. By the time Sheriff Hale returned to Mill Creek, word of the abandoned wagon had already spread like wildfire. The townsfolk were gathered in small knots along Main Street, whispering as though their voices might awaken something lurking in the trees. Jonathan dismounted slowly, scanning their worried faces. He had kept order here for years, but fear was a sickness harder to treat than any law could cure. Old farmer Harlan Beckett was the first to approach. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen too many bad seasons. "Sheriff, you'd do well to stay clear of that river," he warned, his voice rough with conviction. "Folks been saying for years it's cursed. Anyone not from here that sets eyes on it too long, they don't come back." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Curses don't leave boot prints in the mud, Harlan. Men do." But the farmer only shook his head. "Call it what you want, that water ain't right." Inside the general store, where the scent of flour and kerosene lingered, Jonathan found Dr. Eliza Thornton studying her notes. She had already gathered details from locals who remembered other disappearances. "There's a rhythm to it, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Every few months, another family traveling through, gone without a trace. It's never one of our own. That is no coincidence." Deputy Samuel leaned against a shelf, restless. "With respect, Doc, maybe folks just got lost. The Ozarks are thick country. Wander too far, you won't find your way out." Eliza gave him a sharp look. Lost travelers don't abandon wagons with food untouched. These families were interrupted. The tension in the room thickened. Jonathan understood Samuel's doubt. He himself struggled to believe in patterns that hinted at something beyond simple crime. Yet he also knew Eliza's sharp mind rarely erred. That evening, Jonathan held a small meeting in the church hall. The pews filled with men and women clutching lanterns, their faces pale in the flickering light. The sheriff laid out the facts. The wagon, the missing family, the footprints leading to the river. When he finished, silence gripped the room. Finally, Martha Clay, a widowed seamstress, spoke from the back. We can't fight the river, Sheriff. If it's calling strangers to it, best we leave it alone. My sister's already talking about packing up and heading west. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Fear was winning. Families spoke of selling their land, of leaving Mill Creek before the Black River swallowed more souls. Jonathan could see the town unraveling before his eyes, not from bandits but from dread. He raised his voice above the murmurs. Leaving solves nothing. The river won't vanish, and neither will the truth. If there's danger, it's my duty to face it. But I need cooperation, not panic. A man in the front row muttered, "Easy for you to say, Sheriff. You've seen war. We're just farmers." The remark stung Jonathan more than he cared to admit. He had indeed seen war, and the memory of it weighed on him daily. But this creeping fear that bled into every corner of town, felt worse than gunfire. It was a battle fought without bullets, and he wasn't sure how to win it. When the meeting ended, most left with their doubts intact. Outside, the night pressed in, the cicadas shrill in the trees. Samuel caught up with Jonathan as they walked back toward the office. "Sheriff, truth be told, I don't think we'll get volunteers for a search. Folks are scared stiff. You and me, that might be all we've got." Jonathan looked toward the dark outline of the forest, the river winding unseen beyond it. "Then you and me will have to be enough. But remember, Samuel, fear spreads quick, faster than any outlaw. If we don't get ahead of it, Mill Creek will tear itself apart before we find out what's hiding in those woods." The deputy nodded, though unease lingered in his eyes. Jonathan felt it too. The river was more than water cutting through the valley. It was a wound, and unless he uncovered what bled beneath its surface, it would swallow not only strangers, but the very soul of Mill Creek. The morning sun rose heavy with humidity, turning the streets of Mill Creek into a haze of dust and light. Jonathan walked across the square, his hat pulled low as whispers trailed behind him. The meeting at the church had sown more unrest than unity, and he knew it. Now, instead of finding answers, he would have to contend with men who saw opportunity in the town's fear. Silas Crowley was waiting outside the courthouse, leaning on his silver-tipped cane. At 55, he was one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, his fortune built on lumber and livestock. His grey suit was pressed sharp, his mustache trimmed to perfection, a stark contrast to the farmers around him. When he spotted Jonathan, his smile spread wide, but his eyes carried no warmth. "Sheriff Hale," Crowley said smoothly, "you're stirring up quite a commotion with all this talk of disappearances. Folks are jittery, and jittery folks don't make for good business. Best you let these wanderers' misfortunes lie where they fell." Jonathan's boots struck the boards of the porch as he mounted the steps, standing level with the man. "And leave the truth buried? That's not how I was raised to wear this badge." Crowley chuckled, tapping his cane. "Truth, Sheriff, is a commodity like any other. Sometimes it costs more than it's worth. You go chasing shadows along that river. You'll waste what little resources this town has left. Better to let it pass. Families come and go. It isn't our concern if some never reach their destination." Samuel, who had followed close behind, bristled. "So, we just ignore families vanishing into thin air? That's your solution?" Crowley's gaze flicked toward the young deputy, dismissive. "My solution, boy, is stability. Fear drives property prices down, drives good folk out. I've already made offers on several parcels of land. If they want to sell and flee, so be it. Mill Creek could stand to be in the hands of someone who knows how to keep order." Jonathan felt the heat rise in his chest. He had seen men like Crowley before, men who thrived not on strength but on the weakness of others. "Order built on fear isn't order," he said coldly. "It's rot, and I won't see this town hollowed out because you profit from it." For a moment Crowley's smile slipped, revealing the steel beneath his charm. "Careful, Sheriff. Your duty is to protect the town, not bleed it dry chasing wild tales. You keep pressing this matter, you may find your badge worth less than the paper it was stamped on." The words hung heavy between them, sharper than any blade. Jonathan stared at him, unwavering, though he felt the truth of the threat. His position was fragile. If the council sided with Crowley, he could be stripped of authority before he ever set foot back at the river. Later that afternoon, Samuel found fresh tracks along a wooded trail near the southern edge of the river. Wagon wheel ruts cut deep into the earth, but just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. No broken branches, no sign of where the travelers had gone. It was as if the trail had been swallowed whole. Samuel rode hard to bring the news, his face flushed with both heat and unease. "Sheriff, it don't make sense. Wheels don't just stop rolling. Something's covering their tracks, deliberate-like. Jonathan listened in silence, the pieces grinding together in his mind. Families missing, belongings left untouched, trails that ended in nothing, and a man like Crowley eager to silence any search for truth. That night, as he sat in his office with the lamplight burning low, Jonathan knew the stakes had shifted. It wasn't just about vanished travelers anymore. It was about power, about men who stood to gain from the fear that strangled Mill Creek. And somewhere in that tangle of greed and shadow, the Black River flowed, carrying its secrets deeper still. The tension in Mill Creek deepened as July pressed its weight upon the valley. The heat was merciless, pressing down on the town with a damp, suffocating grip. Jonathan Hale had grown used to complaints about the weather, about crops, about the price of feed. But now every conversation bent toward the river. Fear was no longer whispered in corners. It was spoken plainly, heavy in every face that passed him by. News arrived with a blow harder than any rumor. The Bennett family, traveling north from Arkansas, had been last seen making camp along the Black River. By morning their wagon was found overturned, their fire burned down to ash. Their horses wandered back to town days later, reins dragging, eyes wide with panic. Of the Bennetts, husband, wife, and 2 children, not a soul remained. Jonathan stood at the livery where the horses had been brought, stroking the neck of one mare still trembling, as though from some remembered terror. Samuel leaned on the stall, his expression troubled. "Same as before, Sheriff," the deputy said. "Wagon left behind, food untouched, not a single trace of where they went. Only difference this time is there's more of 'em gone. A whole family." Jonathan's hand stilled on the mare's mane. "And their horses come back without them. That means they weren't stolen. They broke free or were set free." Eliza appeared, her satchel in hand, eyes sharp as ever. "I examined the site," she reported. The ground told a story. Children's prints alongside the adults, moving toward the river, then gone. No blood, no sign of struggle beyond the confusion of steps. They walked willingly, or were led. Samuel's jaw tightened. Led by who? Or by what? The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jonathan turned sharply. "We don't entertain superstitions, Deputy. Men are responsible for this." Always men. Yet even as he said it, doubt crept in. He had studied the tracks himself. Families didn't vanish into thin air. But if bandits were at work, why leave valuables behind? Why take lives without profit? By evening the town square was restless. Families packed wagons ready to leave Mill Creek before darkness could swallow another name. Mothers clutched children close. Fathers argued over land deeds they now wished to abandon. Jonathan climbed the steps of the church once more, calling for calm, but his words found little purchase. "It ain't safe," shouted a farmer from the crowd. "First strangers, now whole families. Who's next?" "You expect us to stay, Sheriff, while the river takes what it pleases." Jonathan raised his voice, steady and unflinching. "The river takes nothing. Something, or someone, uses its cover, and I will find them. But if you run now, you give this valley over to fear, and you may never return." Murmurs rippled, some agreeing, most unconvinced. Silas Crowley's voice rang out above the din, smooth and commanding. "The sheriff means well, but his pursuit leads us nowhere. The Bennetts chose a poor campsite. Their fate is tragedy, not mystery. If others wish to leave, I will gladly purchase their land at fair value." Jonathan felt anger rise like fire in his chest. "You'll not profit from their grief, Crowley. Not while I stand here." But Crowley only smiled. Knowing the fear in the crowd weighed heavier than the sheriff's words. Families began signing papers, exchanging land for coin, eager to flee before their names became another tale whispered in dread. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his office, lantern light casting long shadows against the walls. The ledger lay open before him. With a heavy hand he wrote, "The Bennetts, husband, wife, 2 children, vanished by the river. Horses returned alone. Cause unknown." He closed the book and leaned back, exhaustion pulling at his bones. Outside, the river rolled on unseen in the dark, steady and patient. He knew this was no longer an isolated threat. It was a pattern that could not be ignored. And with every family lost, the hold of fear on Mill Creek grew stronger, threatening to unravel the town itself. Jonathan Hale had never been one to hesitate, but as dawn broke over Mill Creek, he felt the weight of every step he was about to take. The Bennett family's disappearance gnawed at him like an old wound, and he knew the time had come to push further than cautious observation. The Black River would not yield its secrets from afar. He needed to walk its banks, to press into the thickets and find what waited hidden. Samuel Carter was at the ready, rifle strapped across his back, youthful eagerness flashing in his eyes despite the danger. "You think we'll find tracks still fresh, Sheriff?" he asked as they mounted their horses. "If there's anything left to find, we'll see it," Jonathan replied, though his voice carried little comfort. "But remember, Samuel, this isn't a hunt for glory. It's a test of patience. The land keeps its secrets close." Dr. Eliza Thornton insisted on joining them. She rode a mule, steady and unshaken, her satchel tied securely at her side. "You'll need more than rifles out there," she said firmly. "If we come upon anything, a survivor or even remains, I intend to know the cause. Too much has gone unexamined already." Their small party rode into the trees, leaving behind the last sight of town. The forest was thick, the air heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. Sunlight broke through only in shards, painting the ground in shifting patterns. The deeper they went, the more the sounds of civilization faded, until all that remained was the hum of cicadas and the occasional call of a crow. By midday the heat had grown oppressive. Sweat ran down Samuel's brow as he hacked away vines with his knife. "No wonder travelers lose themselves out here," he muttered. "Feels like the forest closes in the further we ride." Jonathan kept his eyes forward. "The land is unforgiving, but it isn't what makes people disappear. Don't give it more power than it deserves." Yet inside, he could not shake the unease that every tree seemed to watch them, every rustle in the underbrush carrying unseen intent. They came upon the remnants of a camp, ashes scattered in a ring of stones, a broken pot, the faint outline of bedrolls pressed into the dirt. Samuel crouched, running his hand through the cold ashes. "Sheriff, this can't be more than a week old. Could have been the Bennetts." Eliza examined the ground with care. No signs of violence here. They ate, they rested. Then something drew them away. She looked toward the river, its dark surface visible through the trees. Always the water. The three of them stood in silence, the river's steady murmur seeping into their thoughts. Jonathan felt the same pull he had noticed before, not physical but insistent, as though the water itself demanded attention. He shook it off and tightened his jaw. "We move on. Keep your eyes sharp." As the sun dipped lower, storm clouds gathered. A sudden summer shower swept through, soaking their clothes, turning the ground to mud. Horses stumbled on slick slopes, and branches snapped under the weight of water. Progress slowed to a crawl. Jonathan urged them forward, though his body ached from the strain. "Sheriff," Samuel called over the rain, his voice tinged with frustration. "What if this is a fool's chase? What if the river's already claimed them, same as the others?" Jonathan reined in his horse, water dripping from the brim of his hat. His gaze was hard. "Then we owe it to their memory to know how, to understand. The dead deserve truth, Samuel, and the living deserve protection. That's our charge." The storm eased as quickly as it had come, leaving the forest drenched and steaming. The group pressed on, deeper still, until the river wound close again. And there, on the far bank, Jonathan spotted the faint trace of another fire pit. The smoke long gone, but its presence undeniable. "We're not alone out here," he murmured, his voice low and certain. The forest quieted as the evening drew near, shadows stretching long between the trees. Jonathan, Samuel, and Eliza followed the faint remains of the fire pit across the riverbank. The ground was damp, footprints pressed shallow into the mud. Whoever had camped there had left in a hurry, but not long ago. Samuel leaned low, tracing a mark with his hand. "Could be trappers. Maybe hunters." Before Jonathan could reply, a voice called from the thicket. "Hunters don't leave fires smoldering." The three turned sharply, hands ready at their sides. From between the trees stepped a man in worn buckskins, his beard unkempt, his rifle slung loosely across his shoulder. His eyes were sharp, cautious, as though he weighed whether to trust the very air he breathed. "My name's Elias Finch," he said, raising a weathered hand in uneasy greeting. "I've lived near this river longer than most of you been drawing breath, and I know better than to light a fire where the water can see it." Jonathan studied him closely. The man carried the look of someone who survived not by chance, but by hard-earned instinct. "Sheriff Jonathan Hale," he replied, his tone measured. "These are my companions, Deputy Carter and Dr. Thornton. If you've been here long, maybe you can tell us what you know about these disappearances." Elias gave a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Disappearances? That's too kind a word. The river don't take kindly to strangers. Draws 'em in, makes 'em forget their senses. I've seen it. Men walk straight to the bank like moths to a flame, staring into the water till they stepped too far. Samuel scoffed, shaking his head. You expect us to believe the river calls people? That's foolishness. Elias's eyes narrowed. Call it foolish if you want, boy, but I've buried enough bones near its edge to know it ain't mere bad luck. Folks don't just vanish for no reason. Something about this river pulls at the mind, and when it's done, all that's left is an empty camp and grief. Eliza's gaze sharpened. You've seen this more than once? Elias nodded grimly. Too many times. Travelers, wanderers, never locals. Same pattern every season. That's why I keep my traps away from the water, safer in the hills than near that cursed current. Jonathan crossed his arms. If you know so much, why haven't you spoken to the town? Why not warn others? The trapper's expression hardened. Because Silas Crowley would have me run out before I drew another breath. He's been after my land for years, saying I'm a squatter. I go spouting talk about the river, he'll use it as excuse to toss me to the road. You want my help, Sheriff? You'll promise me protection. Otherwise I keep my silence. Jonathan held his gaze, weighing the man's words. Elias Finch might be paranoid, but he didn't strike him as a liar. There was truth buried in his rough voice, truth sharpened by years of surviving where others had not. Help us, Jonathan said finally. Show us what you've seen, and I'll see to it Crowley doesn't lay a hand on your land. That's a promise. Elias studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Then come with me. He led them along a narrow trail through the thick underbrush until they reached a bend in the river where the water ran slow and deep. There, among the reeds, lay a collection of belongings, boots half-rotted, a rusted kettle, pieces of fabric faded by sun and rain. Samuel bent to pick up a child's shoe, his hand trembling. God help us, he whispered. How many families has this river swallowed? Elias answered in a low voice. More than the town will admit, and unless you act fast, Sheriff, it won't be the last. Jonathan stared at the dark water, his reflection wavering on the surface. He felt the weight of the promise he had made to his town, and the heavy certainty that Elias Finch was only the beginning of truths he did not want to face. The riverbank lay still after Elias Finch's warning, the air thick with the scent of wet reeds and damp earth. Jonathan studied the pile of abandoned belongings, the silent testimony of families who had come before. He could feel Samuel's unease pressing against him like heat from a fire, and it was only a matter of time before words broke loose. This don't sit right, Sheriff, Samuel said sharply, tossing the small shoe back into the pile. We're listening to the ramblings of a hermit who lives off rabbit skins and fear. For all we know, he's behind it himself. Why trust a man who hides in the woods? Elias's eyes narrowed, his weathered face tightening. Watch your tongue, boy. I've survived here because I know the dangers. I've no need for the blood of innocents to feed me. Samuel stepped closer, his hand twitching near his revolver. Convenient, ain't it? He's the only one claiming to know the truth, and he's got a yard full of stories but no proof. Sounds like a liar to me. Jonathan cut between them, his voice hard. Enough. His eyes moved from one to the other, measuring the fire in Samuel's expression and the cold steadiness in Elias's. This isn't about pride. It's about answers. And Elias has given us more than shadows. He's shown us a place where the river hides what it takes. Eliza, who had been quiet, stepped forward, her gaze sharp as glass. Samuel, you're letting fear guide your words. Elias's account matches the evidence I've gathered. Travelers vanish, belongings remain, always near the water. If he speaks of a pattern, I believe him. Samuel turned on her, frustration brimming. So you'd stake lives on the word of a trapper no one in town trusts? Her voice did not waver. I'd rather trust a man who's lived beside the river for 20 years than those who deny what's before their eyes. Jonathan placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, steadying him. Listen, son. Trust is earned, I know. But leadership means choosing when to believe, even when doubt's chewing at your gut. Right now, Elias gives us direction. Until I see reason otherwise, we follow it. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He turned his gaze back to the river, his silence carrying the weight of reluctant obedience. Jonathan knew the young man's pride had been wounded, but this was a test they would all have to endure if they hoped to survive. Elias motioned toward the trees. There's more you ought to see. Campsites swallowed by time, places the river keeps its secrets. They followed him deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing beneath heavy branches. The air grew cooler, shadows lengthening as evening approached. Each step carried the tension of men bound together not by trust, but by necessity. As they walked, Jonathan felt the gravity of his decision. Choosing to trust Elias meant risking Samuel's loyalty, and Samuel was more than a deputy. He was the one person Jonathan counted on when danger struck. Yet ignoring Elias's warnings would mean discarding the only lead they had. It was a choice between stability and truth, and Jonathan knew truth demanded sacrifice. By the time they reached the bend in the river, the last light of day burned low on the horizon. Elias knelt beside a half-submerged camp, its canvas shredded and sinking into the mud. Pots and utensils lay scattered, waterlogged, as if a family had risen in unison and walked away without returning. Eliza crouched, examining the remnants. It's as if time itself stopped here. They left everything. No signs of animals, no signs of theft, just absence. Jonathan's chest tightened. The river murmured softly beside them, a sound both soothing and sinister. He looked at Samuel, who still watched Elias with suspicion. This fragile alliance would not hold unless he could mend the fracture. "We stand together, or we fall apart," Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying finality. "The river won't give us answers unless we take them as one." Samuel gave a stiff nod, though his eyes lingered on Elias with mistrust. Elias remained silent, his expression unreadable. The current beside them rippled in the fading light, as though the water itself waited for their resolve to falter. When Jonathan Hale returned to Mill Creek with Samuel, Eliza, and Elias in tow, he already felt the storm brewing. News of the Bennett family had not faded. Instead, it had spread, tangled with rumors and sharpened by fear. As they rode down the main street, shutters creaked closed, voices hushed, and children were pulled inside. By the time Jonathan dismounted in front of the courthouse, half the town had gathered, waiting for him. Inside, the council convened in heavy silence. Silas Crowley stood at the center, his cane striking the floor with each measured step. His voice carried the authority of wealth, a dangerous weapon in a town so fragile. "Sheriff Hale," Crowley began, "you've taken it upon yourself to drag this town deeper into madness, and now you bring a vagrant like Elias Finch to stoke the fire. This ends here. Arrest him or surrender your badge." Gasps rippled through the room. Jonathan kept his stance firm, though he felt Samuel tense beside him. Elias met Crowley's accusation with a calm, bitter smile, as though he had long expected this day. Jonathan's voice cut through the chamber. "No man is arrested on hearsay. Elias has lived by the river for decades. He's seen what others won't even admit. If you want truth, you'll hear him out." Crowley's lips curled. "Truth. He speaks of rivers that whisper and waters that steal souls. Do you call that truth, or is it madness?" Before Jonathan could reply, Eliza rose from her seat in the gallery. Her voice, clear and steady, silenced the murmurs. "I've examined the evidence myself. Families vanish always by the water. Their belongings remain untouched. This is not madness. It is a pattern. Dismissing Elias will not change that." The room shifted uneasily. Some nodded, others whispered, but Crowley would not yield. "Dr. Thornton, your skills are in medicine, not law. The sheriff is leading us down a path of ruin. If he continues, Mill Creek will collapse under fear and folly." Jonathan stepped forward, his words calm but edged with steel. "The town is already collapsing, Silas. Not because of me, not because of Elias, but because truth is being smothered. I won't look away while families vanish. If you care for this town, you'll stand with me. If not, at least admit you care more for land than for lives." The council chamber grew tense, every eye watching as Crowley tightened his grip on his cane. For a moment it seemed as if he might press harder, but then he leaned back with a mocking smile. "Very well, Sheriff, chase your ghosts. But when the town breaks, don't expect me to save it." That night, in the quiet of the sheriff's office, Samuel laid a small leather journal on Jonathan's desk. Its cover was cracked, its pages water-stained. "Found this hidden near the Bennett's camp," Samuel explained, his voice hushed. "Could be the husband's." Writing stopped sudden like he put it down mid-thought. Jonathan opened the journal, his eyes moving over the uneven script. Entries spoke of the family's journey north, weather, supplies, small quarrels on the trail. Then came a strange note. "The river shines at night. The children say they dream of it, even when they're asleep by the fire. I feel it too, though I don't speak it aloud. It pulls at me." The last entry ended abruptly, ink smudged, as though the writer's hand had faltered. "We camp close to the water tonight. It feels nearer, louder somehow." Jonathan closed the book slowly, his chest heavy. Eliza, seated across from him, watched with solemn eyes. It matches Elias's account. They were drawn, Sheriff, step by step, thought by thought. Samuel shifted uneasily. So what now? Folks already think the river's cursed. If word of this journal spreads, they'll bolt for good. Jonathan placed a hand on the leather cover, the decision pressing down on him like iron. Then we keep it close. For now, this stays between us. But make no mistake, the river is no longer just rumor, it's a threat, and it's coming closer with every passing day. The journal sat on Jonathan's desk long after the others had gone. He read and reread the final entries, each time feeling a chill crawl deeper beneath his skin. There was no mention of danger, no cries for help, just a steady descent into something unspoken, a pull that grew stronger the closer the family camped to the water. That slow, creeping influence disturbed him more than violence ever could. By morning, clouds had thickened over Mill Creek, the sky low and grey. Jonathan stood outside the sheriff's office, breathing in the sharp scent of impending rain. Eliza arrived first, followed by Samuel, who looked like he hadn't slept. "I've been thinking about that journal," Samuel said quietly. "Those dreams, the way he described the river. What if it ain't just people getting lost? What if it's something worse, something that gets in your head before you know you're gone?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "That's what frightens me. This isn't just danger. It's influence. Quiet, subtle but real. The kind that changes men before they even know it's happened." Eliza glanced between them, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion lining her face. "Then we need to study it. But more than that, we need to understand why. There's a purpose behind this. No one vanishes by accident." They returned to the river with Elias guiding the way. Rain began to fall as they traveled, light at first, then steady. By the time they reached the familiar bend, water dripped from their hats and coats, soaking through to the bone. "This here," Elias said, pointing to the river's edge, "is where I found a traveler last year. He wasn't dead, not yet, just gone inside. Stared at the water for hours, couldn't speak, didn't blink. He died 2 days later." Samuel shivered despite the heat under his coat. "You're sure it's not sickness, fever or poison?" "I know madness when I see it," Elias replied. This was different, like he'd seen something he couldn't leave behind. Jonathan knelt near the water, staring at the current. It moved slow, deceptively calm. Yet there was a rhythm beneath it, a cadence he couldn't explain. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened, not with his ears, but with something deeper. The river whispered, not in words but in feeling, heavy, drawn. "Sheriff," Eliza said behind him, her voice cautious, "you've been out here too long, you need rest." "I'm fine," he muttered, rising quickly, brushing mud from his hands. But his head swam, and his breath caught shallow in his chest. The river was wearing him down, not with fear but with presence. Back in town that evening, Eliza cornered him in the office. "You're not invincible, Jonathan. Whatever's out there, it's affecting you." He hesitated before answering. "It's not just affecting me, it's changing me." He paused, his voice lowering. "I dreamed last night. I was standing in the river, not drowning, standing, watching something move beneath the surface. And I didn't feel fear, I felt peace." Eliza's expression darkened. "That's not peace, that's surrender. You need to resist it, not rationalize it." Samuel entered then, clutching a soaked map. "There's something you need to see. I was out near the West Ridge, high ground. Looked down and spotted an old hollow near the water. Thought it was just a sinkhole, but then I saw the wood frame. There's a cave, Sheriff, one nobody talks about. Big enough to hide a dozen men." Jonathan leaned forward, his fatigue forgotten. "Where exactly?" Samuel spread the map, pointing to a bend northwest of where they'd camped. "Here, hidden behind brush. Could explain why tracks vanish. Maybe they ain't vanishing, they're being led underground." Eliza's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then we've been looking in the wrong place. It's not just the river. It's what lies beneath it." Jonathan stared at the map, heart thudding in his chest. The answers they sought weren't in the water's current. They were buried in the stone below, waiting to be unearthed. They set out before dawn, moving through the mist with urgency. The map Samuel had marked burned in Jonathan's mind. A cave near the western ridge, obscured by trees and nearly invisible unless seen from above. If there were answers to be found, they would be inside that hollow. Elias led the way, silent and watchful. Jonathan followed close behind, rifle slung across his back, boots heavy with mud. Samuel and Eliza kept pace, their eyes scanning the brush for any sign of movement. The rain from the day before had softened the ground, and the trail was slow, every step sinking into the damp earth. They reached the cave's entrance just as the sun crested the hills, casting a dull glow through the overcast sky. The mouth of the cavern yawned wide, nearly hidden behind a wall of ivy and moss. Wooden beams framed the opening, old cracked, blackened by time. "This ain't natural," Elias muttered, running his hand along the frame. "Someone built this, maybe decades ago." Jonathan lit a lantern and stepped inside, his breath catching in the sudden drop of temperature. The air was cool, damp, and thick with the smell of wet stone and rot. Every sound, the crunch of gravel, the scuff of boots, echoed off the walls as though the cave itself were listening. The tunnel sloped downward, narrow at first, then widening into a chamber large enough to stand in. Scattered across the ground were remnants of old camps, broken crates, rusted pots, scraps of cloth. Samuel knelt by a torn satchel, lifting a rotted ledger from within. "It's from one of the missing families," he said, brushing the dirt from its cover. "Looks like it was left here weeks ago." Eliza moved carefully, examining scorch marks on the walls. They were here. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a hiding place, and recently used. Jonathan's lantern revealed something else. Scratches on the walls, long and deliberate. Symbols. Not letters, not numbers. Just lines and shapes carved deep into the stone. "What do you make of it?" he asked Elias. The old trapper squinted. "I've seen marks like these before, near old mining shafts, signposts, territory markers. Could be someone's way of claiming the place." "Then someone's using these caves," Jonathan muttered. "Maybe for years." They pressed deeper. The tunnel forked several times, each passage winding and narrow. They marked the walls with chalk as they went, careful not to lose their path. The deeper they moved, the darker the stone became, swallowing the light and the air. Suddenly, Samuel stopped, hand raised. "Hold on. Hear that?" They froze. From somewhere ahead came the faintest sound, metal against stone, a low scrape followed by silence. Jonathan held his breath, listening. The sound returned, softer now, retreating. He motioned forward. "Someone's here. We're not alone." Elias gripped his rifle. "Could be a sentry or worse." Eliza's voice was low. "No more guessing. We need to know who's been using this cave. And why." They followed the sound, moving slow, every footstep measured. The passage narrowed again, forcing them to move single file. The air grew staler, harder to breathe. A thin draught blew from deeper within, carrying with it a foul odor, sour and metallic. As they turned a final corner, Jonathan raised his lantern and stopped short. Before them lay a second chamber, larger, hollowed out with care. Crates stacked in the shadows, barrels sealed shut. A table stood near the far wall, covered in maps and papers weighed with stones. It was a camp, organized, recent. Someone had been living here. Samuel whispered, "Sheriff, what is this?" Jonathan stepped inside, eyes scanning every surface. "This isn't a hiding place. It's a base of operations." He approached the table, lifting one of the maps. It showed the river, the trails, and marked spots, circles drawn in red ink where the disappearances had occurred. Eliza stepped beside him, voice tense. "They're not just watching, they're planning." And somewhere in the dark behind them, a footstep echoed. Jonathan turned sharply, lantern raised, his pulse thudding in his ears. Another footstep echoed, closer this time, then silence. Samuel swung his rifle toward the passage behind them, eyes wide, breath shallow. "Who's there?" Jonathan called out. His voice cracked the stillness like a whip. No answer came, only the low, steady drip of water from somewhere deep in the stone. They waited, motionless. Nothing. Finally, Jonathan turned back to the table and spread the map open. Red circles marked more than just campsites. They outlined a pattern, forming a crescent along the river's edge. Every family that had vanished was within that arc. Eliza leaned in, voice steady. This was deliberate. They weren't random attacks. Someone's been choosing the targets. Following travelers. Samuel scanned the room, the fear in his voice replaced by anger. So all this time it wasn't the river pulling people in. It was someone using it. Jonathan nodded. And they've had help. This setup, it took resources, planning. This isn't the work of one man. Elias moved toward the crates and pried one open with the butt of his rifle. Inside, bundles of clothing, canteens, children's toys, all water-damaged, all clearly taken from different camps. His jaw clenched. These were stolen from the families, after they were taken. Jonathan stepped back, heart pounding. Not bandits, smugglers, slavers. Eliza's face tightened. No, something more organized, something built to erase people without a trace. She lifted a bundle of papers from beneath the map, ledgers, names, dates. One page caught Jonathan's eye. It listed 5 family names, including the Bennets. Next to each, a check mark. "Confirmed," he whispered. Samuel stepped forward. "So they're keeping records? Like it's a business?" Elias spit on the floor. "Only a devil keeps score like this." As they examined the room, a realization began to settle over Jonathan, cold and sharp. These disappearances weren't accidents or acts of nature. They were calculated, coordinated, and the worst part, someone in Mill Creek had to be involved. No one outside could know where travelers camped unless they were told. He stared at the ledgers again. Someone's feeding them information. These families didn't stumble into traps, they were guided. Samuel frowned. But who'd do that? Who in town would even know when folks were passing through? Eliza looked up, her voice brittle. Someone with power. Someone with ears everywhere. Someone like Crowley. Jonathan felt a sick certainty bloom in his chest. Crowley had always known too much. He'd fought every search effort, pressured the council, offered to buy land from grieving families. And now, faced with this room, with these maps, with this evidence, Jonathan could see it clear as day. He straightened, voice low. "He's behind this," Elias growled, "and he's been using these caves to get rid of every last trace." Samuel slammed a fist on the table. "We can't let him keep doing this, Sheriff. We got to bring him down." Jonathan nodded, slow and grim. "We will, but not like fools. We need proof, enough to put him away so deep he'll never buy his way out." He gathered the maps, the ledgers, the marked papers. "We take these, we show the town, but we don't move until we're ready. If Crowley catches wind, he'll burn it all." From deeper inside the cave, a faint metallic clang echoed. A door, a gate, something closing. The 4 of them froze. Elias whispered, "We've stayed too long." Lanterns dimmed as they backed toward the entrance, weapons ready. Each step was deliberate, every breath shallow. The cave seemed to close in behind them, as if unwilling to release what they had learned. When they reached the surface, the sky had turned dark, the air heavy with storm. Jonathan looked over the ridge, down toward Mill Creek, where lights glowed faint in the distance. The town had no idea what had been built beneath its soil, but soon it would, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The storm broke over Mill Creek, just as Jonathan and his group reached the tree line. Lightning flashed above the ridgeline, casting the town below in stark relief. Thunder rolled like cannon fire, ominous, unrelenting. They were soaked to the bone, but none of them stopped moving. The evidence they carried was heavy not just in weight but in consequence. Jonathan's mind spun with possibilities. How Crowley would react, how deep his influence reached. Who else might turn on them before the truth reached daylight? They didn't have time to wait. They needed one more step, one more move to corner him before he could strike first. As they reached the sheriff's office, Samuel pulled Jonathan aside. "Sheriff, what if Crowley already knows we've been to the caves? What if he's watching us right now?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He stared into the night, rain pouring down, wind howling through the street like a warning. "Then we need to make him think he's won." They worked quickly. Elias and Eliza secured the documents in Eliza's medical office, while Jonathan and Samuel returned to the cave entrance to lay a trap. They left just enough evidence behind to draw Crowley's men: an empty satchel, a map corner burned in the lantern's flame, muddy boot prints staged to look like a panicked escape. By the next evening, the bait had taken. Jonathan watched from a high ridge as 2 of Crowley's riders approached the cave, torches in hand. They entered with weapons drawn, unaware that they were being watched. "Do we move now?" Samuel whispered. Jonathan shook his head. "Let them lead us back." They followed the riders from a distance, trailing them through the forest as the moon rose, casting silver light through the clouds. The men returned to Crowley's estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fence, guarded by dogs and men with rifles. From the cover of trees, Jonathan watched the gates close behind them. "There's our nest," Samuel spat. "What now? Walk through the front door?" Jonathan's voice was hard. "No. We cut the head from the snake." At dawn they returned, this time with Elias guiding them through the rear trail that bypassed the estate's main road. They climbed over the ridge, slid down the slope, and found the servants' entrance unguarded. The mansion was still asleep. Inside, the corridors were lined with rich carpets, oil paintings, and silence. Jonathan led the way, each step measured. When they reached Crowley's study, he kicked the door open with one swift strike. Crowley was already standing behind his desk, fully dressed, a pistol in his hand. His eyes locked onto Jonathan's, and a thin smile spread across his lips. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said calmly. "You've been busy, Sheriff." Jonathan raised his revolver. "It's over. We have your ledgers, your maps, testimony. You won't buy your way out of this." Crowley's gaze flicked toward Samuel, then Elias, then Eliza. "So this is your army, a boy, a doctor, and a hermit. Touching," Samuel growled. "You think you're untouchable? Think again." Crowley didn't flinch. "I've built this town, fed it, clothed it, kept it safe while men like you clung to your morals like rusted guns. You think you'll survive what comes after me?" Jonathan stepped forward. "We'll rebuild on truth, not fear, not blood." Crowley's finger twitched near the trigger, but Jonathan was faster. A shot rang out, not to kill, just enough to send the pistol flying from Crowley's hand. "You're done," Jonathan said. Outside, the townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the gunshot. Eliza stepped forward, holding up one of the ledgers for all to see. "This is what he's done," she shouted. "This is who he is." Crowley stood motionless, his empire crumbling beneath him. And as the rain began to fall again, Jonathan knew this battle was over. But the reckoning had only just begun. Word spread through Mill Creek faster than fire through dry brush. Silas Crowley had been exposed. By mid-morning, the streets were alive with voices, some shouting in outrage, others whispering in disbelief. The ledgers, maps, and records had been laid bare for all to see, and there was no denying their contents. Names of the missing, detailed plans, evidence of a long calculated betrayal. Crowley sat in the courthouse jail, stripped of his power, though not of his arrogance. Jonathan stood outside the cell, arms crossed, watching the man who had haunted this town from behind polite smiles and polished boots. "You'll hang for this," Jonathan said plainly. Crowley looked up, calm as ever. "You think taking me down will clean this town? You think it ends with me?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "No, but it starts with you." Outside, the townspeople gathered in front of the courthouse steps, waiting for justice. Some clutched their hats, others held onto their children, as if needing to protect them from the memory of what had been allowed to fester under their noses. Eliza addressed the crowd, standing firm beside Samuel and Elias. She held up one of the pages they'd taken from the cave, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "These aren't just papers. These are lives. Families that were watched, followed, stolen, all while we were told to ignore the signs." Elias stepped forward. "I've seen too much go unpunished, watched too many graves dug near that river. It ends now." One man in the crowd, a blacksmith named Tom Granger, shouted, "How do we know there ain't more of them? How deep does this go?" Jonathan stepped onto the platform. His coat was soaked from the night before, his face lined with exhaustion, but his voice held steady. "We don't know everything yet, but we have what we need to begin." Crowley orchestrated it. He paid men to watch travelers, to mark camps, to clean up the trail, all so he could expand his reach, buy land, and keep this town afraid. A woman cried out, "He took my brother. We told the sheriff back then, and nothing came of it." Jonathan's heart clenched. "I wasn't sheriff then, but I am now. And I swear to you, we will not forget again." The town council, now shaken and humiliated, had no choice but to act. That afternoon, Crowley stood trial before a jury of his peers. Witnesses spoke: Eliza, Samuel, Elias. Even townsfolk who had once defended him now saw the truth. The record sealed his fate. The verdict was swift: guilty of conspiracy, extortion, obstruction of justice, and accessory to multiple disappearances. Sentencing followed. The judge's voice rang clear in the courtroom. "You used fear to build your kingdom, but this town will no longer be ruled by shadows. Silas Crowley, you are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." There was no celebration, no cheers, just a long, heavy silence. Justice had come, but its cost weighed on every soul present. That evening, Jonathan returned to the riverbank. Alone, he stood where the Bennett's wagon had once been found, the current slow and dark before him. He removed his hat, letting the wind touch his brow. Samuel joined him, quiet at first. "It's over, ain't it?" Jonathan shook his head. "No. The ones we lost, they're still gone, but the killing's done. That's something." Samuel hesitated. "Folks are saying you saved this town." Jonathan looked out across the river. "Maybe. Or maybe we just finally stopped lying to ourselves. Behind them, Mill Creek was beginning to breathe again. Shops reopened, voices lifted, families unpacked wagons they'd meant to flee with. But the scars would remain for a time, and the river, ever silent, continued its flow. Autumn settled into Mill Creek with a slow, golden hush. The trees turned amber and red, the air grew crisp, and the Black River, though unchanged in appearance, no longer inspired the same fearful glances. There was still grief, wounds that would not heal quickly, but the fear that had once paralyzed the town had begun to dissolve like mist in the morning light. Jonathan Hale sat on the bench outside his office, coat buttoned tight, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. The town moved around him with quiet purpose. Children laughed again, merchants reopened stores once shuttered. And though the river still ran in its shadowed path, people no longer crossed the street to avoid speaking of it. Samuel stepped up beside him, hat pushed back on his head. "Feels different, don't it?" Jonathan nodded. "Like a fever broken." The young deputy sat beside him, glancing toward the trees. "You think it's really over?" "No," Jonathan said softly, "but it's no longer hidden. That makes all the difference." The case against Crowley had traveled far, reaching beyond Mill Creek to Jefferson City and beyond. More arrests followed. Names from the ledgers were traced, connections uncovered. A network had been built beneath the soil of honest land, and now it was crumbling, piece by piece. Dr. Eliza Thornton had become something of a town leader, respected not just for her intellect, but for her courage. She continued her work at the clinic, but now found herself advising the council as well. Her voice no longer questioned, but welcomed. Elias Finch was given full ownership of his land, protected by law, thanks to Jonathan's intervention. He didn't stay in town often, preferring the solitude of his traps and trails, but he came in once a week for supplies, and when he did, children ran to him, eager to hear his stories. One afternoon, Jonathan walked the river's edge alone. The current whispered as always, steady and deep. He no longer feared it, but he respected it. Some mysteries, he had learned, were not meant to be solved entirely. Some truths remained tangled in the roots below. He removed a small bundle from his coat, one of the Bennett's children's toys, faded but intact. Kneeling, he placed it gently near the bank. "You're not forgotten," he murmured. "None of you." The wind shifted through the trees, as if answering. Back in town, Samuel had begun taking on more responsibility. He rode patrols alone, managed disputes, and was trusted by those who once saw him only as a boy. One morning, Jonathan handed him a freshly polished badge. "You've earned it," he said. "Time you wore it proper." Samuel stared at it for a moment, then nodded. "You think you'll ever leave this place?" Jonathan looked out toward the horizon, where the river bent and disappeared behind the hills. "No, this town still needs watching, and I reckon I've still got eyes sharp enough to see." That night, at the church hall, the townsfolk gathered not for mourning but for remembrance. Names were read aloud, candles were lit, and when Eliza stepped to the front, she did not speak of tragedy but of resilience. "We have learned," she said, "that evil does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it wears the smile of someone we once trusted, but light always finds a way through. And we, together, have lit that way." As the candles flickered, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. Not closure, but clarity. The Black River would always run dark, but now the town beside it had chosen to walk in the light. Before we close this story, if you've followed us this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These tales, rich in truth, justice, and the cost of silence, deserve to be remembered. And if you're ready for the next journey, don't wait. Click on the video on your screen now and dive into another forgotten mystery, one that might be even closer than you think.